Thank you. So this hopefully we'll touch on some of the issues that have come up today. Some of the terms, I think, carry over into this paper. Although it's not a social science paper, I think it's involved with thinking about some of the same questions, some of the same issues. Children have a central significance in the history of cinema, both as audience and as subject. Of the 10 films shown at the very first film screening in Paris on December the 28th, 1895, by the Lumiere brothers, 2 of the films were of children. One was of a little girl trying to grab a goldfish in a fishbowl, and the other was of a baby being fed. I'll just show you a clip from it. This is one of the 2 Lumiere brothers. And this is his child and his wife. There's no narrative. All of the films were about 40 or 50 seconds long. They're effectively moving pictures, family snapshots. And it wouldn't have had music. I teach a course in silent cinema, and every single DVD of early cinema has a tinkly piano. It drives you insane after a while. They all sound the same. So cinema, as a medium in its infancy, cinema begins with a child, begins with the image of a child. And on the other hand, from the early 1900s onwards, discussions about the cultural and psychological effects of film viewing upon audiences among reformists, politicians, journalists and academics have centred on the rhetorical figure of the child, the susceptible, sensitive child, as a way of thinking about and measuring the effects of this new medium upon audiences. So thinking about the child and childhood has offered us a way of thinking critically about the progressive effects of cultural and technological change. As an example, American film historian Tom Gunning has written about the anxiety around the cultural impact of cinema in early 20th century America after the 1905 Nickelodeon boom, in which America suddenly went from having a few hundred film theatres to having tens of thousands within the space of several months. It was a massive social shift. And as Tom Gunning said, moving pictures were rife with anxieties for the genteel representatives of American culture, including the issues of a working class audience and the sexual awareness of children. That conjunction of children and working class audiences is very, very common as well. But the concern was with the exposure of children to films about crime and images of violence and images of explicit sexuality, because before the introduction of the Hays Code in 1930, early American cinema in particular was really quite sort of brutal and sexually explicit. So anxieties about the intangible social effects of new entertainment and communications media, and calls for legislation and regulation, almost always articulated in relation to their damaging or corrupting effect on children. Mobile phones, the internet, social networking media, home video and video nasties, record players and the novel, popular theatre, they're all sort of, they're all seen as sort of particularly threatening to children. The child is used in these discourses as a sort of uncritical, unironic thermometer by which we can measure changes in the sort of technological and cultural ecosystem. So the figure of the child is very instrumental in sort of forming public policy and sort of pushing regulation through. As an example of this, Jane Addams was an early American temperance reformer and social activist, very concerned about children's welfare. She was the first female Nobel Prize winner, and an important early writer upon the sort of sociological and cultural effects of cinema. The House of Dreams is one of her early essays about the effect of this explosion in film viewing. And she uses this example to demonstrate the danger of unrestricted access of children to the cinema. 13 young lads were brought into the municipal court in Chicago during the first week that Raffles, the amateur cracksman, was upon the stage, each one with an outfit of burglar's tools in his possession, and each one shamefacedly admitting that the gentlemanly burglar in the play had suggested to him a career of similar adventure. So for Jane Addams, this demonstrates the risk of cinema. Not, how smart these kids were. They immediately came up with a good alibi. It wasn't me, Your Honour, it was the play. But this is the danger of cinema, the danger of sort of influence and imitation. The pain fund studies, which you probably are very aware of, that were conducted in Ohio between 1929 and 1932, really exemplify this concern with media effects. They've been very important in sort of shaping media effects analysis subsequently, and they involved a mixture of qualitative analysis. The researchers watched thousands of films and drew up sort of categories of content. Statistical analysis, they looked at who was going to the cinema and how frequently, and they found that children were very regular film viewers because there was no restriction, there was no certification, so children can watch anything, and cinemas were very cheap. And sort of psychological studies as well, a mixture of sort of case studies, questionnaires, physiological analysis, pulse rates, in order to sort of test emotional responses to films. And they were concerned with the degree of emotional stimulation that children received when watching films, their propensity to imitate the behaviour they saw on screen, the effect of films on attitude formation, how their values were sort of altered by watching films, and the effects of regular cinema going on sleep patterns and academic performance as well. It's been very, very important in sort of really sort of setting, for all the problems with it, there were no controls, it was very intrusive, it was very selective. It's been very important in sort of setting the terms for media effects research. So cinema's fascination with the child is multiple. The child in cinema is a symbolically loaded, semantically flexible figure. It stands as an affective cinematic figure for the domestic, for the personal, the intimate, the everyday, or as a plastic symbol of innocence, fragility, potentiality, unrealized futures, corruption, mortality, uncanny threat in different narrative contexts. Thinking about the figure of the child in cinema invites us to think about the complexity and the historical contingency of our conceptions of childhood. How the child, Baby Peggy is a really good example of how differently children were understood in the 1920s. This image of a sort of sexualized, smoking child was acceptable in mainstream cinema. She was a big star until her father, who was a manager, lost all her money, millions, and she ended up later in her career working as a sort of activist and campaigner for the welfare of child actors. It's a really interesting history. Thinking about the figure of the child in cinema also invites us to think about how the child is mobilised to limit access to visual culture, restrict access to visual culture, and like I suggested, how the masses are always thought of, or generally often thought of the masses in inverted commas in childlike terms. The masses needing protection through political representation and sort of top-down governance. The child stands for the general public in certain discourses. In a broader sense, the centrality of the child in cinema can be understood in relation to cinema's capacity to record and represent the passage of time. And the child is one of the ways in which cinematic time has been made visible. For the French film theorist Michel Chion, the technical stabilization and commercialization of sound film technology in the 1920s, the mid to late 1920s, meant that cinematography, writing with movement, becomes what he calls chronography, which is writing with time. It becomes a time-based medium when sound film emerges in the mid to late 1920s. Although cinema offers us the spectacle of animation of moving pictures, Chion suggests that what cinema does more profoundly from the 1920s onwards is offer us What it does that other media can't is offer us the spectacle of the passage of time. It makes the passage of time visible, since what a film does is manipulate time. And as film technology develops, time is depicted in quite different ways. In the silent period, just to sort of illustrate this, time is very flexible. Temporality is very flexible. This is sort of Shion's argument. So if you look at a silent comedy, say a film by Buster Keaton, with another authentic soundtrack, what you see is films in which it's very, very normal for time to be sped up, to be accelerated. Slapstick comedies, silent comedies were typically projected faster than they were shot in order to produce this sort of comic effect of rapid movement, but also a sort of dynamic effect, so the stunts are more spectacular. It was very, very common for films to be not quite so common. Hang on. Not quite so common, but it wasn't unusual to see film running backwards as well. If you look at documentaries from the late 1920s, a film like Man with a Movie Camera, which is a film about everyday life in a Russian city, the film intercuts reverse motion shots with forward motion shots. Leni Riefenstahl's documentary of the 1936 Berlin Olympics does the same thing. There are sequences, particularly famously the high diving sequence, in which we have sort of shots where divers are moving backwards intercut with shots where divers are moving forwards. Shion says, come sound film, this becomes impossible. Cinema gets locked into a fixed temporality, because if you run a sound film backwards, it becomes incomprehensible. If you run it at a different speed, it becomes absurd. The meaning changes. So with the introduction of sound film around about 26, 27, and it happens in different countries at different points, cinema acquires a new temporality. And for Shion, time and temporality and the problem of the representation of time becomes a central theme or a central sort of concern of filmmakers. Okay, so in this sense, what filmmakers do, what cinema does very effectively, is manipulate time, compressing time, dilating it, reorganizing it, reconfiguring it through narrative structures and through editing strategies. Films can project us backwards or forwards in time, isolating and emphasizing particularly significant moments. Referring back to what you were saying, cinema itself as a medium is a time machine. That's what it does. And the mechanism by which it operates is the cut, which affects an instantaneous transition from one shot to another and from one moment to another. So thinking about how time is represented in cinema, how cinema makes time visible, invites us to think about how time is conceived and to what extent technology shapes our understanding of time as well. How what we think about as time is mediated through various representation technologies or communications technology. One sort of quite well-known example, this is a completely arbitrary slide actually, but is railway time. It was only in 1840 in Britain that standard time was introduced, a national standard time. Up until that point, different parts of the country had local times. It was when the railway network was built in the early 19th century that they found that this was a problem. It made timetabling impossible, and it led to sort of a huge number of crashes as trains, because train drivers couldn't work out what time the train was coming in the opposite direction on the same piece of track. So in 1840, standard time was introduced based on Greenwich Mean Time, and from that point on in Britain, everyone operated according to the same time. The clock in every part of the country was fixed to the same point, even in Carnforth Station in Lancashire on the set of Brief Encounter. And that's embedded with the process of industrialisation and the sort of premium placed on sort of time management and efficiency. Audio-visual media also have a very sort of, this is coming back to cinema, have a very sort of important role in shaping our experience of time. this is a sort of very anecdotal sort of example, actually, but my partner was recently talking to a friend of ours who's a nurse about the effect of childbirth TV programs, the sort of reality TV genre, programs like One Born Every Minute and Midwives, on the expectations of women coming into the maternity unit in Lancaster Infirmary, because what she was finding, or what they were finding, she was saying, is that increasingly, women were coming into the unit and getting really frustrated because things weren't moving as quickly as they were supposed to, and they weren't following the sequence that they followed in televisual reality. So all these women, or a lot of these women, become really anxious and frustrated and uncomfortable because this isn't how it's supposed to work. It's going too slow, because it goes faster and more smoothly on TV at this compressed time. So this is thinking about how time and historical intervals are represented in film and television is a way for us to think about how our understanding of time is shaped quite fundamentally by our exposure to, our sort of, our familiarity with these sort of conventional representations. The film doesn't just represent time, it redefines it, it reshapes our sort of experience of it and our understanding of it. But while cinema has the capacity to document the passage of time, for Michel Chion, this is one of the things it does centrally as a medium, fiction films are generally very rarely shot over any extended period. It's far more usual for films to simulate the passage of time. Film does this just as effectively as it documents it. This paper is prompted partly by the broadcast last year of a film by the British director Michael Winterbottom called Every Day. It was shown on Channel 4 or More 4 or Film 4. It was a Channel 4 funded film and subsequently released into cinemas. Winterbottom's a very interesting filmmaker, very diverse, hugely prolific. He's made about 20 films. He's only in his late 40s, and he's made a lot of films about children as well. It's one of the sort of central themes in his body of work. Every Day is a film about a family with 4 children and 2 parents. The father of the family is in prison for a crime that's never explained, and it tracks the family over 5 years of sort of daily life. We see the children at school, we see family meals, we see them going to visit their father in prison. We see him come out on day release from time to time. But one of the possibly unique features of this film is that it was shot over 5 years. So the duration of the shoot matches exactly the period covered in the narrative on screen. The problem for filmmakers in representing extended periods of time, Winterbottom said in an interview about this film before it's released, is that they have to, essentially you have to fake the passage of time. What he set out to do, he said, with this film, the starting point was to try and deal with time passing in a story. So it's a film that is precisely concerned with the depiction of time, documenting the passage of time. The reason why filmmakers have to fake it is because it's too expensive to shoot a film this way. So there are a whole range, this is another film that's been mentioned today, a whole range of sort of devices, techniques available to filmmakers to fake it, to simulate the passage of time. CGI, prosthetics, acting techniques, makeup, all of which are used in The Curious Case of Benjamin Button, which is a fascinating sort of disturbing film about aging and about temporality. And it's a film which really explores the sort of that idea of a sort of time valor and irreversible temporality, because we have these two paradoxical or contradictory temporalities, where Benjamin Button is a senile baby when he's born and gradually grows younger as he ages, which is what makes it such a sort of disturbing film. Very sad. I watched it with my 9-year-old daughter, who was in floods of tears. She couldn't bear it. She had to stop. So one of the potential values of cinema, thinking critically about sort of around cinema, is that it invites us to think about, or to think outside the rigidity of linear, irreversible temporal frameworks. Cinema plays with time, it explores time. There's a handful of examples of films that are shot over protracted periods, also known as Othello, was famously shot over 3 years. Eraserhead took David Lynch 5 years to shoot, but that's more to do with sort of financial incompetence and sort of they couldn't get the money together to do it in a reasonable time frame. Television, however, allows filmmakers the possibility to work over extended periods. The financial stability of television studios allows commissioning and development of projects over much longer periods. Television drama series, soaps, documentary series, magazine programs are all examples of this sort of extended or protracted production. And one of the most celebrated and historically significant examples of longitudinal documentary filmmaking in a sort of popular context, as the symposium brief observes, is the Up series that was produced by Granada Television, and which was almost certainly an influence on Winterbottom's film, because he's very familiar with British film and TV history. 7 Up was broadcast in 1964 as part of the World in Action Current Affairs documentary series, and it was a program that focused on 27-year-old children from different parts of the country and different social backgrounds, in order to explore the socially deterministic function of class. That was the sort of the brief for the program. It's shot in a style that draws on the loose handheld style of observational cinema, documentary cinema, and it assembles footage of the children playing at home, in the classroom, and intercuts that with interview footage with the children, talking head interviews like this in groups or individually. I'll just show you a very brief clip. This is from the end of the end of this episode, 7 Up. The program is strung together by a very sort of authoritative voiceover commentary. This is the conclusion of the first program.
At the end of their very special day in London, after their trip to the zoo and the party, we took our children to an adventure playground where they could do just what they liked. Those from the children's home set about building a house. There's Nicholas and Tim. And Bruce. John. Susie. Becky and her friends. Give me a child until he is 7, and I will give you the man.
Okay, which is the sort of the premise for the program. Although it was commissioned as a single program, the decision was taken later, 7 years later, to produce a follow-up, and again another 7 years after that. And when they got to, I think, 28, they decided to keep this going as a series. It's now up to 56. 56 that was broadcast last year. So it's one of the most prominent examples of longitudinal documentary, because it's been running for 50 years. It's inspired a whole series of spin-offs in different countries beyond Britain, and work in other media. The British artist Julian Waring produced a 2006 piece called Family History, which she said was inspired partly by the 7up series. And the premise of this series is that it dramatises political history. That's how the director and researcher, Michael Apted, explains its sort of intentions. Doing so through a focus on individuals from different classes. And for film theorist Stella Brutzzi, it does this in a very conventional way, a very familiar way. In keeping with its longevity and its relative stability, 7up is also representative of a persistent fixation in British cinema and television documentary upon the quotidian and the personal, and how best to show them. And this returns us to Winterbottom. I'm going to show you a clip from Winterbottom's film, and then tie this together with some concluding remarks. As well as being concerned with how to show time passing, Winterbottom's film was concerned with the ordinary and the everyday in precisely the same terms that Apted, Brutzzi suggests, is sort of is orienting his film project, his documentary project. And the solution for Winterbottom was to do this, to explore the ordinary and the everyday and the passage of time through a film about children. Every day is about the growth of these children. You see them go from being in primary school to, with the older two kids at the end of the film, starting secondary school. So the child is a means of making the passage of time visible. And that's what makes the film so sort of upsetting to watch, because the father is missing all of this as it happens. So I'll just show you a brief clip. This is from near the beginning of the film. It's the first visit we see where the children are going into the prison visiting room.
Christmas? You had a nice time at Christmas?
Yeah, we've got some photos to show you.
Oh, no monkeys. Got a lot of cars.
Steffi made that card.
No.
Katrina's speaking better, right?
Yeah?
Yeah, a little bit better.
Oh, the douche.
Look, the fish is dying.
Do you need to
Yeah, well, look, it's on its side all the time.
maybe just like slowly sideways?
I don't know what to do with it.
The tires?
Yeah, it's
Got early this morning, what time she got?
yeah, it's really early. It's tired.
Is it? You looking after your mum? You looking after your mum?
Stephanie is.
You mean that? What did I tell you? Look after your mum and none of the house. So what do you mean? Trouble, so? What's he been doing here?
Cheeky.
Cheeky? Well, don't be naughty. Have you been cheeky as well at school? Have you been a good boy?
Yeah, Sean's been good.
Okay, so if we think, so it's a fiction film, but it's largely improvised. Most of the or a lot of the people in it are non-actors, so there's a mix of professional actors and non-actors, including the four children who are siblings. So if we think about Winterbottom's film as a sort of commentary upon 7up and the documentary and social realist traditions that the series belongs to, because in terms of his his sort of statement of intent in terms of the title. He's connecting it, he's linking it with those traditions. It invites us to reflect on one or two questions. When we're presented with cinematic or audio-visual depictions of events over a period of time, whether they're documentary or fictional, or a combination of the two, which is one of his sort of key working practices, his films tend to blur that distinction. To what extent can we distinguish a simulation of the passage of time from an authentic document? These films rely upon the sort of confusion of that distinction for their affective charge. They blur this distinction between documentary and fiction film consistently by using documentary style and techniques. So it's a staged drama, but it invites us to reflect on the performative quality of documentary film and TV. For instance, Winterbottom said one of the problems they encountered shooting this film, which was largely improvised, was that they couldn't do retakes, because when they tried to retake a scene, the children became self-conscious and wouldn't do what they did the first time around. So he found a certain amount of resistance that he hadn't expected, but also the sort of awareness that the children had that they were being filmed and they were performing for the camera, they were being directed, and were sort of uncomfortable about what was required of them. So the problem of improvisation the filmmakers encountered raises questions about the possibility of authenticity, objectivity, spontaneity when using cameras to produce a documentary record. More broadly, it problematizes the apparently straightforward distinction between documentary and fiction. But a lot of film theory is sort of concerned, particularly documentary theory, is concerned with interrogating. It invites us to reflect on what precisely is constituted by the ordinary or the everyday. Michael Apted says about the 7 Up series that it's concerned with the ordinary life, honouring the ordinary life. And if ordinariness is one of the objects of study, it's one of these common sense terms that is sort of immensely sort of dense and vexed. And there's a conference taking place at the University of York in a couple of weeks on the everyday and the quotidian. So it's and it's an important term for various theorists as well. Striking feature of Winterbottom's film is that there's very little exposition. It just starts, there's no voiceover commentary, there's almost no explanation about what's happening, where it's set. We have to sort of pick it up as the film goes along. We never find out why the father's in jail. We don't know how long he's been in jail at the beginning of the film. There's no resolution at the end of the film. It just sort of comes to a stop as abruptly as it begins. So in refusing to explain anything to us about the circumstances of the characters, refraining from a sort of direct judgmental treatment of issues such as the education system, judicial processes, the prison system, the integrity or the disintegration of the nuclear family, questions of class and precarious labour, all of which are frames you could read the film through. The film is sort of determinedly ambivalent and open-ended, and it highlights by contrast the sort of didacticism and the careful framing of material you see in 7 Up, which presents itself to us as a sort of, as an objective documentary. One that in fact has a very clear liberal argument to make about social class, opportunity and self-identity. And makes very clear the desire for certain sort of documentarians to organise material into a narrative structure. It's very narrative. It uses all sorts of techniques to build suspense and sort of deferment into the organisation of the programme, to dramatise it. In this claustrophobic focus on the family, Winterbottom's film invites us to reflect upon the value of concentrating upon the individual as a way of thinking about and making sense of social and political formations and shifts and structural issues. And finally, what becomes clear thinking about the cinematic child is that our concepts of childhood, thinking about the cinematic child historically, is that our concepts of childhood are framed and filtered not just through the repertoire of narrative images of childhood that are prevalent throughout cinema, but also through the vast accumulation of images in sort of other media that we are surrounded by. We live in a sort of landscape of images of childhood, narrativized images of childhood, all of which help to sort of, construct these concepts of childhood that we're interested in thinking about. So I'll stop there. Actually, thank you.